The bride handed me $800 and asked, "Can you help ruin my wedding?" The bride, Lynn, stood there with a serious expression. "I need you to object at my wedding later when the ceremony starts. Please." I was shocked. I mean, I'd been in love with her since junior year in high school, and even before then, we were best friends for years. So you'd think that this would be a dream come true, but it wasn't. It made absolutely no sense. "Why me? You've already said no to me back when I confessed my feelings to you," I reminded her. She frowned, her face full of guilt. "I'm asking you because I know you'll say yes, and because this morning, I found out the groom is cheating on me." I almost didn't believe her. The guy she was set to marry, Oliver, was perfect. He had a good job, a kind family, and gave her the kind of romantic love people write songs and movies about. I knew they loved each other, so for him to end up a cheater, it didn't make sense. But I couldn't stand it either. Lynn deserved better than a cheater. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do it." She smiled softly. "When the priest asks if anyone objects, just stand up. Say you object. Don't bring up the cheating. Just say you still love me and I'll handle the rest," she instructed. I studied her face while she talked. She didn't look angry, not even sad, just defeated. If Oliver really cheated, wouldn't she be furious? Wouldn't there be some kind of fire in her eyes? I should have asked more questions, but all I could think about was that maybe, just maybe, if she wasn't marrying Oliver, I'd finally have a chance. I left the bridal room and entered the wedding venue, a fancy vineyard I could never afford. Oliver waved me over and smiled, shaking my hand. "Hey man, so glad you could make it. Lynn didn't invite a lot of friends, but I'm glad she at least has her best friend," he said, patting my shoulder. I looked at the sincere expression on his face and still couldn't believe this was the guy who cheated and hurt Lynn. But I made a promise I never should have made. I sat in the back row in my only suit, practicing my lines under my breath. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, my heart was hammering so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I stood up. "I object. I'm still in love with Lynn." The room went silent. Oliver turned around, his face hurt and confused. Lynn's eyes found mine. "I'm so sorry." She turned to Oliver, her voice breaking. "I love him too." Then she dropped her bouquet and ran, grabbing my hand as she passed my row and dragging me toward the doors. I heard the room burst into shouts and arguments behind us just before the doors shut. We kept running until we reached my truck in the parking lot. She climbed in, still in her wedding dress, and I drove off. The entire ride was filled with her sobbing, completely destroyed by what we'd done. I didn't know what to say either, but the sadness in her voice broke my heart. So I hit the brakes and turned on the road towards the Santa Monica Pier parking lot, our old hangout spot, the same place she'd broken my heart years ago. "Come on," I said quietly, taking her hand gently. "This'll take your mind off of things." We walked onto the pier together, her in her wedding gown, me in my only suit, people staring and congratulating us without knowing the full story. We got funnel cake and walked along the boardwalk, and for a moment, it almost felt normal, like we were just two kids again, before weddings and confessions and heartbreak. Her phone kept buzzing in her clutch. She'd glance at it, and then put it away. "Is that Oliver?" I asked. She nodded, her face looking even more hurt. We sat down across from each other on the Ferris wheel with the sun panting the sky orange, when I finally said, "There's something I don't understand. Oliver's the nicest guy I'd met, and that's saying a lot considering I lost you to him. Why would he ever cheat? Like what happened? How did you find out?" Lynn looked at me completely caught off guard and broke down. "I'm so sorry. I lied." I froze. "What do you mean you lied?" "Oliver, he never cheated. I made that up. This morning, just before the wedding, I got a call from my doctor. I'm terminal. How could I make the man I love the most in the world marry someone who was dying?" She sobbed, tears falling straight onto her dress. "I thought if I destroyed the wedding, if I made him hate me, he could move on easier. He wouldn't have to suffer watching me shrivel away. But why me? Don't you know I'd feel hurt too, knowing I could never have you and now I was really going to lose you?" I shouted, fighting back my own tears. "I know. I chose you because I knew you couldn't say no. I made you hurt him for me, and I'm so sorry. You deserved better than being used like this." She sat there crying harder than she did earlier. Then I did something stupid. I reached across and took her hand. Then I lifted it to my lips and kissed it gently. "Whatever time you have left, I'm staying." But when the Ferris wheel reached the bottom, I spotted him. Oliver, still in his tux. He looked at Lynn, then at me, then at our hands still intertwined. "Lynn," he said, his voice breaking, "please, just tell me what's really going on." Lynn's fingers tightened around the Ferris wheel safety bar, and she stared at Oliver for what felt like forever before letting go of my hand. The operator cleared his throat and gestured for us to exit, clearly uncomfortable with whatever drama he'd walked into. Lynn stood up slowly, her wedding dress making soft rustling sounds as she stepped out of the cart onto the wooden pier. Oliver stayed frozen in place, his tuxedo jacket wrinkled and his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. I followed behind Lynn, feeling like I shouldn't be there, but also unable to just walk away and leave her alone with this. Wedding guests from the vineyard had started appearing at the pier entrance, probably following Oliver here after he left, and they stood in small groups, whispering and pointing at us. Lynn took 3 steps toward Oliver and stopped, her hands twisting together in front of her dress. She opened her mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, her voice was shaky and quiet. She told him she needed to explain something important, something she should have said this morning instead of making up lies and destroying everything. Oliver's face shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like fear as he watched her struggle to speak. Lynn moved closer to Oliver until they were only a few feet apart, close enough that I could see her hands shaking. She took a big breath and started talking about the phone call from her doctor that morning, the one that came right before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. The words came out in a rush as she explained about the diagnosis, about finding out she was terminal and panicking because she couldn't make him marry someone who was dying. Oliver's face went completely white, and he reached out to grab the pier railing with one hand like his legs might give out. Lynn kept talking, her voice breaking as she described how she thought the kindest thing would be to make him hate her so he could move on easier instead of watching her get sicker. She said she knew it was wrong, but she was scared and didn't know what else to do. I stood there feeling like an intruder watching this private moment unfold, but I also knew I couldn't leave without explaining my own part in this mess. Oliver's eyes stayed locked on Lynn's face, and his jaw worked like he was trying to process information that didn't make any sense. I stepped forward, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to when I admitted that I agreed to object because Lynn told me Oliver cheated. The words felt heavy coming out of my mouth as I explained that some selfish part of me thought it might give me a chance with her if she wasn't marrying him. Oliver turned to look at me, and his expression was this weird mix of pity and disgust that made my stomach hurt, but I deserved both reactions, and probably worse. Lynn started crying harder than before and apologized to both of us, saying she used me and lied to Oliver, and we both deserved better than what she did. Her mascara was running down her face in black streaks, and her carefully styled hair was falling out of its pins. The wedding guests who had followed Oliver were getting closer now, trying to hear what we were saying, and a few people had their phones out, probably recording this whole disaster. Oliver's hands were gripping the railing so hard his knuckles turned white, and I could see him trying to hold himself together. Oliver finally spoke, and his voice was surprisingly calm considering everything that just happened, asking Lynn basic questions about the diagnosis. He wanted to know what type of cancer it was, what stage, what exactly the doctors said during that phone call this morning. Lynn wiped her face with the back of her hand and explained it was advanced and aggressive, but there were treatment options, though she admitted she didn't know much more than what the doctor told her in a 5-minute call. She said the doctor wanted her to come in for more tests and to discuss treatment plans, but that's when she panicked and decided to blow up the wedding instead. Oliver listened without interrupting and then looked around at all the people staring at us from various points on the pier. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk instead of having this conversation on a public pier with tourists and wedding guests watching us like we were some kind of show. His voice stayed level, but I could hear the strain underneath it like he was working really hard to stay in control. We walked back to the parking lot in silence, Lynn between Oliver and me, but not touching either of us. The sun had set completely now, and the pier lights were coming on, casting weird shadows across the wooden planks. When we got to my truck, Oliver said he'd follow us back to the vineyard in his car, and Lynn just nodded without arguing. I helped her climb into the passenger seat, her wedding dress bunching up around her legs and taking up most of the space. Oliver walked to his car parked a few spots away, and I watched him sit there for a minute with his hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. The drive back felt longer than the drive here, even though it was the same distance, and Lynn stared out the window the whole time without saying anything. I kept glancing over at her face lit up by passing streetlights, seeing how small and defeated she looked in all that white fabric. The parking lot at the vineyard still had a few cars scattered around when we pulled in, guests who were probably lingering to figure out what happened or loading gifts into their trunks. They all stopped what they were doing to stare as my beat-up truck rolled past, followed by Oliver's much nicer sedan, and I saw people pulling out their phones again. We headed straight to the venue office where Jasmine was sitting at her desk, surrounded by paperwork and looking stressed. Oliver walked in first and quietly told her the wedding wouldn't be continuing, his voice flat and tired. Jasmine's professional expression that she'd probably been wearing all day cracked, and her face showed real sympathy when Oliver mentioned there was a medical emergency without giving any details. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Cancellation Protocol and started flipping through pages, explaining that she'd do her best to recover whatever deposits she could from the vendors. She picked up her phone and started making calls right there while we stood around awkwardly, talking to the caterer and the florist and the DJ about the situation. Lynn sat down in a corner chair and seemed to shrink into herself, looking small and defeated in her elaborate gown that was supposed to represent the happiest day of her life. The practical business of taking apart a wedding felt weird and surreal, while we were all still processing the emotional bomb that just exploded. Word spread fast among the remaining guests that the wedding was officially canceled, and people started coming up to us with questions. Oliver stood near the office door and politely but firmly told everyone it was a private family matter and asked them to respect our privacy. His parents approached looking hurt and confused, and his mom tried to hug him, but he gently pulled away and said he'd call them tomorrow to explain. I could see the pain on their faces as they walked back to their car, probably wondering what their son's bride had done to cause this disaster. Lynn's mom pushed through a small group of guests and tried to talk to her daughter, but Lynn just shook her head and said she'd explain everything soon. Her mom looked between Lynn, Oliver, and me like she was trying to piece together what happened, and I saw the moment she decided to back off and give Lynn space. More guests filtered out slowly, some shooting dirty looks at Lynn or me, others just looking sad and uncomfortable. Once the venue finally cleared out, and it was just us and Jasmine finishing up paperwork, Oliver told Lynn she should go home and rest. He asked if I could make sure she got there safely, his voice carefully controlled like he was holding back either tears or anger, maybe both. Lynn nodded and didn't argue, which showed how completely exhausted she was from the emotional weight of this day. Oliver said he needed some time alone to process everything that just happened, and I understood, even though part of me wanted to say something to make it better. Jasmine handed Lynn a folder with copies of all the cancellation paperwork and gave her a sympathetic look before we left. Oliver walked out to his car without looking back at us, and I watched him drive away before helping Lynn back into my truck. The drive to Lynn's apartment was quiet, except for her occasional sniffles as she stared out the window at the dark streets passing by. I kept thinking about how this morning I was lying in bed fantasizing about maybe having a chance with her, imagining some scenario where she'd realize she loved me instead of Oliver. Now I was just a guy driving his heartbroken friend home after she blew up her life and hurt everyone who cared about her, including me. The reality of the situation felt nothing like my stupid fantasies, and I felt gross for ever thinking that way. When we got to her apartment building, I had to help her out of the truck because the dress made it hard for her to move, and she almost tripped on the steps leading to her door. She fumbled with her keys for a minute before getting the door open, and then she turned to look at me with red, swollen eyes. She said she was sorry for dragging me into this mess, her voice barely above a whisper, and I didn't know what to say back, so I just nodded. She went inside and closed the door, and I stood there for a few seconds before walking back to my truck, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do now. Back in my apartment that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Oliver's face when he looked at me on that pier, the way his expression shifted from confusion to hurt to something like resignation. The guy never did anything wrong except fall in love with the same woman I loved, and I helped destroy his wedding day because I was too caught up in my own feelings to ask the right questions. Around midnight, I picked up my phone and stared at Oliver's contact info for a solid 10 minutes before I finally started typing. I kept it simple, just said I was sorry for my part in what happened, and that if he needed help coordinating Lynn's medical appointments or anything else, I was available. It felt like the smallest thing I could do after participating in the worst day of his life, but I hit send anyway, and then lay there staring at the ceiling wondering if he'd even respond or if he'd just block my number. My phone buzzed around 2 a.m, and I grabbed it thinking maybe Oliver had texted back, but it was Lynn calling. Her voice sounded raw and scared when I answered, like she'd been crying for hours. She told me she couldn't sleep and kept thinking about what the doctor had said that morning. All these medical terms she didn't fully understand, like staging and metastasis and treatment protocols. I pulled up my laptop, and we looked up information together while she was still on the phone, searching for explanations of the terms her doctor had used and trying to make sense of what it all meant. We found the contact number for her oncologist's office, and I wrote it down along with the hours they were open, so she could call first thing in the morning to schedule a real consultation instead of just that 5-minute phone call that had sent her into a panic. Making an actual plan seemed to calm her down a little, giving her something concrete to focus on besides the disaster of the wedding and the fear of dying. She thanked me before hanging up, and I could hear in her voice that she was exhausted, and I told her to try to get some sleep, even though I knew neither of us really would. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but my brain wouldn't shut off, just kept running through everything that had happened and wondering what came next. Oliver texted back in the morning with just a few words saying he'd be at the doctor's appointment and to send him the details when we had them. His response was cold, but not cruel, which honestly felt like more grace than I deserved. I forwarded him the oncologist's contact info that Lynn and I had found, along with another brief apology that he didn't respond to this time. I spent the rest of the morning sitting at my kitchen table with coffee I didn't really drink, wondering if I was making another huge mistake by staying involved in all of this. Part of me worried that Lynn was just going to keep using me because she knew I couldn't say no to her, that I was falling back into the same pattern I'd been stuck in since high school. But then I thought about her sitting alone in that wedding dress, looking absolutely scared, and I decided that even if this hurt me in the end, I couldn't just abandon her now. Some part of me knew this wasn't about romance anymore, or at least it shouldn't be. It was about being the friend she actually needed, instead of the guy who kept hoping she'd change her mind about me. 3 days later, we all met at the oncology clinic, this sterile building with 2 bright lights and motivational posters on the walls that felt weirdly out of place. Dr. Reka Sloan was younger than I expected, maybe in her 40s, with kind eyes and a straightforward way of talking that somehow made the terrifying information easier to process. She sat down with us in her office and pulled up Lynn's preliminary test results on her computer screen, explaining what the imaging had shown and what additional testing needed to happen before they could finalize a treatment plan. She walked us through the staging process, how they needed to determine exactly how far the cancer had spread and what organs were affected, and she laid out different treatment options that might be available depending on those results. Lynn gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white, and when Dr. Sloan paused, Lynn asked the question we were all thinking. How much time are we talking about here? Dr. Sloan looked at her directly and said that with treatment, they were looking at years, not months, and I saw Lynn's whole body sag with relief at that answer. It wasn't a cure, and it wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope, and that was more than any of us had 3 days ago. Oliver arrived 15 minutes late, still wearing his work clothes like he'd rushed straight from the office, and he slipped into the empty chair next to Lynn without saying anything to me. Dr. Sloan briefly went back over what she'd already explained, and Oliver immediately started focusing entirely on Lynn and the doctor, asking these really practical questions about treatment timelines and side effects, and what Lynn's day-to-day life would look like during chemo. The tension between me and Oliver faded into the background as we all zeroed in on the medical reality in front of us, and I realized this was bigger than our personal drama. Dr. Sloan outlined a plan for imaging scans and lab work over the next week to fully stage the cancer before they could decide on the specific treatment approach. Lynn signed consent forms with shaking hands, while Oliver took notes on his phone about appointment times and what preparation she'd need to do beforehand, like fasting for certain tests or avoiding caffeine. When we finally left the clinic and walked out into the parking lot, there was this strange sense of relief washing over all of us, even though the news itself was scary. At least now we had concrete next steps, instead of just sitting in uncertainty and fear. That afternoon, I got a forwarded email from Lynn, originally from Jasmine at the wedding venue. Jasmine had sent an update on vendor cancellations, explaining that some deposits were completely gone, but she'd managed to negotiate partial returns from a few vendors who were understanding about the medical emergency. The financial hit was still several $1,000s, though, which felt like salt in the wound on top of everything else. Lynn had forwarded it to both Oliver and me without adding any comment of her own, and I could tell from the timestamp that she'd gotten the email right after we left the clinic. The timing sucked, dealing with the practical mess of the canceled wedding while also trying to process a cancer diagnosis. Later that evening, Oliver's friend Leandro apparently called him and convinced him they needed to put out some kind of public statement to stop all the rumors that were spreading through their social circles. Oliver drafted something short about a private medical situation, requiring the wedding to be postponed, asking people for privacy and understanding during a difficult time. He ran the statement by Lynn before posting it anywhere, showing her the draft and asking if she was okay with it, which demonstrated a level of respect that made me feel even worse about my part in deceiving him. Lynn approved it, and Oliver posted it to his social media, and within an hour, people started responding with support instead of speculation. I opened my own social media apps and immediately regretted it, seeing all kinds of gossip and theories about what had happened at the wedding. Some people were blaming Lynn, others were blaming me, and a few were even suggesting Oliver had done something wrong. The speculation was cruel and based on absolutely nothing, and I realized I couldn't handle reading other people's opinions right now when I was barely managing my own complicated feelings about everything. I deleted all the apps from my phone, just removed them completely so I wouldn't be tempted to check. The distance from everyone else's noise felt necessary and almost immediately calming. Lynn texted me about an hour later to thank me for not engaging with any of the posts or trying to defend myself publicly, saying she really appreciated me protecting her privacy instead of adding to the drama. I told her it wasn't a big deal, that what other people thought didn't matter compared to what she was dealing with, and she sent back a simple thank you that somehow felt heavier than the words themselves. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with Lynn's name on the screen, and I answered to hear her crying softly on the other end. She started talking about things she hadn't mentioned before, like how scared she was about losing her hair and not being able to do basic things for herself. She kept saying she didn't want to become a burden on everyone, that the thought of people having to help her shower or eat made her want to disappear. I just listened without trying to tell her it would be okay or that she shouldn't worry about those things. She talked for almost an hour about watching herself fall apart piece by piece, about Oliver seeing her weak and sick instead of the person he fell in love with. Her voice got quieter as she admitted that's why she tried to push him away, because she couldn't handle the idea of him watching her body fail. I stayed on the line even after she stopped talking, just breathing with her, until she said she needed to try to sleep. The next morning, I texted her asking if we could talk in person, and she agreed to meet me at a park near her apartment. We sat on a bench while joggers passed by, and I told her straight up that I was happy to drive her to appointments and help with whatever she needed, but I couldn't do it if she was going to keep lying to me. She looked down at her hands and nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. I said I needed her to be honest going forward, that I couldn't be her friend if she was just going to use me whenever it was convenient. Lynn apologized for manipulating me at the wedding, for taking advantage of how I felt about her all these years. She said she knew it was wrong, and she was sorry for making me hurt Oliver when he didn't deserve it. The conversation was painful and awkward, but it felt like we were finally being real with each other, instead of playing the same game we'd been stuck in since high school. She promised to be honest, and I believed her. Or at least, I wanted to believe her. 2 days later, Lynn texted me saying she was meeting Oliver at a coffee shop and asked if I could not contact her for a few hours. I told her that was fine, and spent the afternoon trying not to check my phone every 5 minutes. She finally texted around 4, saying she'd apologize to Oliver without asking him to take her back or forgive her, just owning what she did to him. She said he listened to everything and told her he needed time to process, but he wasn't cutting her out of his life completely. I texted back that Oliver was showing more grace than most people would, and she sent back a simple yes. The staging scans started the following week and took 2 full days of different tests at the hospital. Oliver showed up for the morning appointments, and I came for the afternoon ones, and we ended up overlapping in a few waiting rooms where we tried not to make eye contact. We focused on practical stuff like making sure Lynn had filled out all her paperwork correctly and that she had water and snacks between tests. The shared purpose of helping her get through the medical procedures made the personal tension fade into the background a little. It wasn't comfortable sitting there together, but it was functional, and that felt like some kind of progress. Lynn looked exhausted by the end of the second day, her face pale from all the fasting and contrast dye and stress. Dr. Sloane's office called 3 days later, asking all of us to come in for the results, and my stomach dropped when I saw the appointment time in my calendar. We sat in her office with Lynn in the middle chair, Oliver on one side and me on the other, while Dr. Sloane pulled up scans on her computer screen. She explained that the cancer was advanced and had spread more than they initially thought, but there were aggressive treatment options available. She talked about a chemotherapy protocol that had shown good results in similar cases, being careful to explain the side effects and challenges while also emphasizing that this was treatable. Lynn asked how long she had, and Dr. Sloane said that with proper treatment, they were looking at years, not months, that people live full lives with this kind of cancer when they get the right care. Lynn started crying with relief, and both Oliver and I reached for her hands at the exact same time, then pulled back awkwardly when we realized what we'd done. Dr. Sloane pretended not to notice and kept talking about next steps and treatment schedules. The next problem came up almost immediately when Dr. Sloane's nurse explained that insurance pre-authorization for the treatment plan could take anywhere from a few days to several weeks. Lynn got visibly frustrated, asking how she was supposed to just wait around when she needed to start treatment as soon as possible. The nurse was sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do to speed up the insurance company's process, that it was just part of how the system worked. We left the office feeling like we'd taken 1 step forward and 2 steps back, getting good news about treatment options, but then hitting a wall with bureaucracy. Lynn was quiet on the drive home, and I could tell she was trying not to lose it completely. The following day, Oliver sent a text to both Lynn and me saying he had savings and could pay out of pocket for treatment if insurance became a problem, that he didn't want money to be the reason her care got delayed. Lynn immediately called him, and I could hear her half of the conversation from across the room, her voice getting higher as she insisted she couldn't accept that kind of help from him. She said she'd already ruined his life and destroyed their wedding. She wasn't going to let him pay thousands of dollars for her medical bills on top of everything else. Oliver must have argued with her because she kept repeating no over and over until finally, she just hung up. She looked at me with tears running down her face and said she couldn't take his money, that it would make everything worse. I understood what she meant, even though practically speaking, it would solve a huge problem. That night, I logged into my bank account and stared at the numbers, doing math in my head about what I could actually afford to contribute. I had maybe $3,000 saved up if I emptied everything, which felt like a lot to me, but was basically nothing compared to what cancer treatment actually costs. The reality of my financial limitations hit me hard, forcing me to accept that wanting to help wasn't the same as being able to help in meaningful ways. I could offer my time and my presence, but I couldn't write checks that would make a real difference in Lynn's care. Oliver could do that, and I couldn't, and that fact stung more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, Leandro apparently showed up at Oliver's apartment and dragged him out for a run, and Oliver told me about it later in a brief text. Leandro had asked him straight up what he actually wanted going forward, not what he thought he should want, but what he really felt. Oliver admitted he was furious at Lynn for lying and at me for going along with it, but he also said he couldn't just walk away from someone he loved who was facing this kind of diagnosis. Leandro told him that was completely normal, that he didn't have to have everything figured out right away. He just needed to set boundaries that protected himself while still showing up for Lynn. Oliver said the conversation helped him realize he could be angry and supportive at the same time, that those feelings didn't cancel each other out. A few days later, Jasmine from the wedding venue called Lynn directly, and Lynn put her on speaker so I could hear. Jasmine explained that she'd contacted all the vendors again and told them about the medical emergency, and several of them had agreed to return partial deposits they'd previously said were non-refundable. She said she was sending back about 40% of what had been lost, which wasn't everything, but was way more than anyone expected to get back. Lynn started crying on the phone and thanked Jasmine over and over, saying she didn't know why a stranger would go to so much trouble for her. Jasmine's voice got soft, and she said she'd lost her sister to cancer 5 years ago, and she remembered how overwhelming everything felt, how the little kindnesses from random people made the biggest difference. After they hung up, Lynn just sat there holding her phone and crying, and I realized that small mercies felt huge right now, when everything else was so overwhelming and scary and out of control. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop screen, typing "therapist near me" into the search bar, and then deleting it 3 times before finally hitting enter. I scrolled through profiles of smiling professionals until I found one named Isabel Gates, who offered telehealth appointments and had availability within the week. I filled out the intake form at 2 in the morning, my fingers hovering over the question asking what brought me to therapy, before typing out something vague about relationship stress and needing help processing difficult emotions. When I hit submit, I felt both relieved and anxious, like I'd just admitted something I'd been avoiding for years. The confirmation email arrived instantly, with a link for my first video session scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and I saved it to my calendar before I could change my mind. I knew I couldn't keep showing up for Lynn in any real way if I didn't deal with why I'd spent so many years chasing someone who didn't want me back, using my feelings for her as an excuse to avoid building an actual life. Thursday came faster than I expected, and I logged into the video session from my couch, adjusting the laptop camera so Isabel could see me clearly. She appeared on screen with a calm, professional expression, asking me to tell her what brought me in today. I started explaining about the wedding and Lynn's diagnosis, but Isabel gently redirected me, asking not what happened to Lynn, but what was happening with me. That question caught me off guard, because I'd gotten so used to making everything about Lynn's crisis that I forgot I had my own stuff to work through. Isabel asked me to describe my relationship with Lynn going back to high school, and as I talked, she started pointing out patterns I'd never noticed before. She said it sounded like I'd been putting Lynn on a pedestal for years, making her the center of my world and defining my self-worth through whether she paid attention to me. When she asked why I agreed to object at the wedding, I started to say it was to help Lynn, but Isabel stopped me and said it sounded more like I was acting out my fantasy of being chosen over Oliver. That hit hard because it was true, even though I didn't want to admit it. She pointed out that if I'd really been thinking about what Lynn needed, I would have asked more questions or refused to participate in something so destructive. Instead, I jumped at the chance because some part of me thought it might finally give me what I'd wanted for years. Sitting there looking at Isabel's face on my laptop screen, I felt exposed and uncomfortable, seeing my behavior laid out so clearly, with no way to pretend it was noble or selfless. Isabel wasn't mean about it. She just stated the facts, and I realized she was right about everything. The session ended with her giving me homework to think about what I actually wanted from my life separate from Lynn. What would make me happy if Lynn wasn't in the picture at all? I logged off feeling raw and a little angry, but also like something important had shifted. Meanwhile, Lynn sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and pen, starting and stopping a letter to Oliver about 15 times before finally committing to the words. She wrote for hours, filling page after page with explanations about the morning of the wedding, the phone call from her doctor, the panic that made her think destroying everything was the kindest option. She didn't make excuses, but tried to help him understand the fear that took over her thinking, how she convinced herself that making him hate her would be easier than making him watch her die. She wrote about loving him more than she'd ever loved anyone, about how that love made her want to protect him, even if her method was completely wrong. She explained her thought process with the fake cheating story, how she knew it would be believable enough to work, how she manipulated me because she knew I'd go along with it. Lynn wrote about regretting the pain she caused him, acknowledging that he deserved honesty instead of elaborate lies designed to push him away. She ended the letter by saying she couldn't promise anything about the future, couldn't tell him what to do or how to feel, but she wanted him to know the complete truth about everything, including how much she genuinely loved him. When she finished writing, her hand was cramping, and there were tear stains on several pages, but she carefully folded the letter into an envelope and addressed it to Oliver. She didn't mail it right away, instead leaving it on her counter where she could see it and second-guess herself for another day before finally dropping it in a mailbox. Oliver got the letter 3 days later and read it twice before calling Leandro, asking him to come over because he needed help with something. When Leandro arrived, Oliver showed him the letter and said he wanted to put out a better public statement about what happened, something more detailed than the vague post about postponement. Leandro read Lynn's letter carefully and then pulled out his laptop, saying they should draft something together that gave people enough information to stop speculating without oversharing private medical details. They worked on the wording for over an hour, Oliver typing out paragraphs that Leandro kept editing down, removing the parts where Oliver sounded too apologetic or took blame for things that weren't his fault. Leandro reminded him repeatedly that he didn't do anything wrong, that Lynn's diagnosis was terrible, but it didn't excuse what she did, and Oliver needed to stop acting like he should apologize for being hurt. The final version acknowledged that the wedding was canceled due to a serious health diagnosis, asked for ongoing privacy and respect, and thanked people for their support without going into specifics about Lynn's condition or the circumstances of the cancellation. Oliver read it over one more time, his finger hovering over the post button, before finally publishing it and immediately turning off comments to avoid the flood of responses. Leandro nodded his approval and told Oliver he did good, that setting boundaries with other people's opinions was healthy and necessary. The post went live on a Friday afternoon, and by evening, Oliver's phone was buzzing with private messages from friends, reaching out with genuine support instead of nosy questions. Several people sent gift cards for meal delivery services or grocery stores, practical help that didn't require emotional labor from Oliver or Lynn. A few friends offered to help with errands or transportation to appointments, specific concrete assistance rather than vague offers to do anything. Lynn saw the post when Oliver forwarded it to her, and she cried reading the supportive messages from people in their community who weren't asking for gossip, but actually trying to help. The small acts of kindness from near strangers touched her more than she expected, these little moments of light breaking through what felt like endless darkness. She texted both Oliver and me screenshots of particularly kind messages, and I could tell she was surprised that people cared enough to send gift cards or offer rides. It reminded all of us that not everyone was spreading rumors or treating this like entertainment, that some people genuinely wanted to help, even if they didn't know all the details. The imaging scan with contrast dye happened on a Tuesday morning, and I drove Lynn to the medical center where they'd inject her with chemicals that would light up her insides for the machine to photograph. The technician explained the procedure while inserting an IV line into Lynn's arm, warning her that some people feel weird sensations when the dye goes in. Lynn nodded and tried to look calm, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she lay down on the scanning table. When they injected the dye, Lynn's face went pale, and she started breathing fast, her eyes wide with panic. I moved closer to the table and started talking her through breathing exercises I'd learned from my own anxiety, counting breaths in and out slowly until her breathing matched mine. The technician paused the scan to check on her, and that's when Oliver appeared in the doorway, holding Lynn's favorite soft blanket and a water bottle, having remembered these comfort items without anyone asking him to bring them. He spread the blanket over Lynn's legs while I kept talking her through breathing, and we worked together without discussing it or acknowledging each other, both just focused on helping Lynn get through an uncomfortable medical procedure. The technician resumed the scan once Lynn's breathing stabilized, and Oliver and I stood on either side of the room watching the machine rotate around her body, mapping the cancer inside her with cold, mechanical precision. When it finished, we helped Lynn sit up slowly, and she drank from the water bottle Oliver brought while wrapped in her blanket, looking small and tired and grateful. Dr. Sloan called us back to her office the following week with the completed imaging results and a treatment plan laid out in a folder on her desk. She explained that based on the scans and lab work, she was recommending an aggressive chemotherapy protocol using 3 different drugs in combination, administered every 3 weeks for at least 6 cycles. She walked us through the evidence supporting this approach, showing us survival statistics and research studies, giving us concrete data instead of vague reassurances. Dr. Sloan explained potential side effects in detail, not sugarcoating how difficult the treatment would be, but also emphasizing that this protocol had shown good results for Lynn's specific type of cancer. She mentioned that depending on how Lynn responded to the initial treatment, they might refer her to a clinical trial later if she qualified, expanding her options beyond standard care. The plan felt structured and evidence-based, something we could follow step by step, instead of drowning in uncertainty about what to do next. Lynn signed consent forms and asked practical questions about timing, wanting to know when she could start treatment now that insurance had finally approved everything. Dr. Sloan scheduled the first infusion for the following Monday, saying there was no benefit to waiting once they had a plan in place. Lynn nodded and said she wanted to move forward immediately, tired of sitting in limbo between diagnosis and treatment, ready to fight this thing even though she was terrified of what the fight would cost her. Walking out to the parking lot after the appointment, Oliver and I both headed toward Lynn at the same time, and I said I'd drive her to the first chemo session on Monday. Oliver stopped walking and turned to face me, his jaw tight, saying he was still her fiancé in every way that mattered, and he should be the one taking her. I felt anger flash through me and snapped back that he was the one who asked for space, that he couldn't have it both ways. We stood there in the parking lot arguing about logistics, while Lynn walked ahead to my truck, and I realized we were both really arguing about our own fear and helplessness, using the question of who drives to chemo as a stand-in for deeper feelings neither of us knew how to express. Oliver said he loved Lynn and wasn't going to abandon her just because she made a terrible mistake, and I said I loved her too and had known her longer than he had. We were getting louder when a voice interrupted us, and we both turned to see Dr. Sloan's nurse standing near the clinic entrance with a disappointed expression on her face. The nurse walked over and said she'd overheard our argument, and she wanted to suggest something that might help everyone. She explained that Lynn would benefit from having a support schedule, so no one burned out trying to do everything alone, and she had consistent help throughout treatment. The nurse pulled out a printed template from her clipboard, showing how to organize caregiving responsibilities across multiple people, with spaces to fill in who would drive to appointments, who would help with meals, who would check in on different days. She handed it to Oliver and said gently that this works better when people cooperate instead of compete, that Lynn needed both of us to think about what actually helped her instead of our own egos. Her practical intervention cut through our emotional posturing immediately, making us both feel like children who'd been caught fighting over a toy. Oliver took the template and looked at it, then looked at me, and something shifted in his expression from anger to resignation. We agreed to sit down with Lynn and work out a schedule together, dividing responsibilities in a way that made sense instead of fighting over every single task. Monday morning arrived, and I drove Lynn to the chemotherapy clinic for her first infusion, having won that particular scheduling discussion through the support template we'd all filled out together. The clinic was bright and clean with big windows, nothing like the dark, scary place I'd imagined, but that somehow made it worse because it looked so normal for something so terrible. A nurse led Lynn to a reclining chair and started accessing her port, explaining each step of the process, while I sat in the chair next to her feeling useless. They hung bags of fluid and medicine on an IV pole, clear liquid dripping down tubes into Lynn's body, poison designed to kill cancer cells faster than it killed healthy ones. Lynn tried to stay positive, smiling at the nurse and making small talk, but I could see her hands gripping the chair arms tightly. The infusion took hours, and I sat there watching Lynn try to read a book while chemicals flowed into her bloodstream, watching her face gradually change from nervous to uncomfortable to quietly miserable. The side effects started before we even left the clinic, Lynn's face going pale and her hand reaching for the small basin the nurse had given her just in case. I helped her walk slowly to my truck, her movements careful like everything hurt, and the reality of what the next few months would look like hit me hard in the chest. This wasn't a movie where love conquers cancer with a montage of brave smiles and recovered health. This was a brutal medical process that was going to hurt Lynn badly before it had any chance of helping her, and all I could do was drive her home and watch her suffer through it. I got home around 10 that night and collapsed on my couch, still in my clothes that smelled like hospital disinfectant, and Lynn's fear. My phone buzzed with a text from Oliver saying he was heading to Lynn's place tomorrow afternoon with some things from their apartment, asking if I could give them space. I typed back that I would, and felt relieved that he was stepping up, even though part of me wanted to be the one there for her. The next day dragged at work, while I kept checking my phone for updates that didn't come, and I had to force myself not to text Lynn asking how she was doing. Around 3 in the afternoon, Oliver sent a photo to our group chat showing him and Lynn sitting on her couch, surrounded by photo albums and loose pictures scattered everywhere. The caption just said spending the afternoon together, and I stared at that photo longer than I should have, seeing Lynn's tired smile and Oliver's hand resting near hers on the cushion between them. I knew they were looking through memories of their relationship, grieving for the future they might lose, and I felt like an outsider watching something private through a window. Later that evening, Lynn sent a long text to both of us, explaining that she needed alone time during the worst days after chemo, the days when she felt too sick to function and didn't want anyone seeing her that way. She wrote that it wasn't personal, but she needed privacy when things got really bad, and we both responded saying we understood, even though my instinct was to show up anyway. Oliver texted just to me afterward saying this was going to be harder than he thought, learning to give space when everything in him wanted to be there taking care of her. I agreed, and we had this weird moment of connection over how difficult it was to respect Lynn's boundaries when we were both terrified of losing her. Monday morning, I walked into my boss's office before my shift started and asked if we could talk about my schedule for the next few months. He looked up from his computer with that expression bosses get when they know you're about to ask for something complicated, but he gestured for me to sit down. I explained that my best friend was going through cancer treatment and I needed flexibility to help with medical appointments, offering to work remotely on days when I had to drive her places. My boss leaned back in his chair and asked how much time we were talking about, and I admitted I didn't know exactly, but probably 1 or 2 days a week for the next several months. He was quiet for a minute doing mental calculations about scheduling and coverage, then said he could make it work, but I'd lose overtime opportunities since remote work didn't qualify. The pay cut would hurt, but I told him I understood and appreciated the flexibility, shaking his hand on the arrangement. Walking out of that office, I felt both relief and worry about money, wondering if I was making another bad decision by putting Lynn's needs ahead of my own financial stability. That evening, I had a video session with Isabel and told her about the work arrangement, expecting her to point out that I was sacrificing myself again. Instead, she surprised me by saying this sounded like a mature choice because I'd set clear limits on what I could sustainably offer rather than trying to be everything for Lynn. She helped me see the difference between healthy support and unhealthy sacrifice, explaining that I was being a good friend without destroying myself in the process. The distinction felt important, even though it was hard to hold on to when my feelings for Lynn kept trying to turn everything into some grand romantic gesture. Oliver sent a message to our group chat a few days later saying that Leandro had been pushing him to see a therapist, and he'd finally made an appointment. He wrote that he needed to deal with his grief and anger about the canceled wedding and Lynn's diagnosis in a healthy way instead of just bottling everything up. Lynn responded with a heart emoji, and I sent back a message saying that was really smart, genuinely meaning it. A week after that, Oliver texted again, admitting he'd been working through his feelings about everything that happened, and he seemed calmer in his messages afterward. The therapy was helping him process the betrayal and the fear and the complicated love he still felt for Lynn, making him more stable and better able to actually support her. I could see the difference in how he showed up for Lynn's appointments, less frantic and more grounded, and it made me realize that taking care of his own mental health benefited all of us. Part of me felt ashamed that I'd been in therapy longer, but still struggled more with boundaries and self-sacrifice. But Isabel kept reminding me that everyone's process looks different. 3 weeks into the chemo schedule, Lynn had a good day where she wasn't feeling sick or exhausted, and she texted asking if we could all walk the Santa Monica Pier together. She said she wanted to revisit the place where everything came out into the open, to make new memories there that weren't just about crisis and lies. Oliver and I both agreed immediately, and we met at the pier parking lot on a cool Saturday afternoon, with Lynn wearing a soft beanie over her thinning hair. We walked slowly with Lynn between us, her pace limited by fatigue and the lingering effects of treatment. She talked about how the pier used to represent just happy childhood memories for her, back when we'd come here as kids to ride the Ferris wheel and eat junk food. Now it was the place where her whole life fell apart and came back together in a different shape, where she'd told the truth about her diagnosis and destroyed her wedding in the same afternoon. Lynn said she wanted to reclaim it as shared ground instead of a battleground, to prove to herself that places could hold multiple meanings and still feel safe. We bought funnel cake from the same vendor as that terrible day, and sat on a bench watching tourists take selfies, and something about the ordinariness of it felt healing. Oliver reached over and squeezed Lynn's hand briefly, and she smiled at him with genuine warmth that made my chest ache, even though I was happy for them. We walked back to the parking lot as the sun started setting, and Lynn hugged us both, thanking us for being there and for not giving up on her, even when she'd tried to push everyone away. At Lynn's next appointment with Dr. Sloan, the doctor brought up something new that made everyone sit up straighter in their chairs. She explained that based on Lynn's specific cancer markers and genetic profile, she might qualify for a clinical trial at a research hospital about 2 hours away. The trial was testing a new treatment combination that showed better results than standard chemo in early studies, offering potentially improved outcomes. Dr. Sloan was careful to explain the logistics, that Lynn would need to travel to the research hospital regularly for treatment and monitoring, which added complications around transportation and scheduling. The trial also had strict protocols and requirements that were more demanding than regular treatment. Lynn listened to all of this, and then said without hesitation that she wanted to apply, that she'd figure out the practical details later, but she was choosing hope over convenience. Oliver and I exchanged glances and both nodded, agreeing that if there was a better treatment option available, then the logistics were just problems to solve. Dr. Sloan smiled and said she'd start the referral process, warning us that acceptance wasn't guaranteed since clinical trials have specific eligibility criteria. 2 days later, Lynn got an email from Jasmine, the wedding coordinator who'd helped them navigate the cancellation. Jasmine wrote that she'd been thinking about Lynn and learned through her vendor network about a charity that provides travel grants for cancer patients in clinical trials. She included the link to the charity's application and a note saying she hoped this might help make the trial feasible if Lynn got accepted. Lynn forwarded the email to Oliver and me with just a string of crying emojis, overwhelmed by this continued kindness from someone who barely knew her. I read through the charity's website and saw that they covered gas costs, lodging, and meal expenses for patients traveling to specialized treatment centers. The grant could actually make the difference between Lynn being able to participate in the trial or having to turn it down due to practical barriers. Oliver texted saying he'd help Lynn fill out the application, and I offered to write a support letter if they needed one. Jasmine's thoughtfulness went so far beyond what a wedding coordinator would normally do, and it reminded me that sometimes strangers show up in your life at exactly the right moment. Lynn spent the next week gathering medical records and letters of support from Dr. Sloan for her clinical trial application. She filled out endless forms asking about her diagnosis, treatment history, and current health status. Oliver helped her organize everything into a clear packet that addressed all the trial's requirements, and I proofread her personal statement about why she wanted to participate. We submitted the application on a Friday afternoon, and then entered this anxious waiting period where none of us could focus on anything else. Lynn checked her email constantly, jumping every time her phone made a sound. Oliver and I tried to distract her with movies and board games, but the waiting was eating at all of us. Then on Tuesday morning, Lynn called both of us at the same time, her voice breaking with tears as she told us the acceptance email had just come through. She was crying so hard she could barely get the words out, relief and hope flooding through after weeks of fear and bad news. The trial schedule would be demanding with treatments twice a week for the first month and then weekly after that, plus regular monitoring appointments. Everyone agreed it was worth it for the potential benefits, and we immediately started planning the logistics of regular 2-hour drives to the research hospital. Lynn applied for the travel grant the same day, and within a week that came through too, covering most of the transportation and lodging costs. Lynn decided it was finally time to tell her mother everything, and she asked if I would come with her for moral support during that conversation. I felt honored that she wanted me there for something so difficult, even though part of me worried I'd just be in the way. We drove to her mom's house on a Sunday afternoon, and Lynn's hands shook the whole drive there, practicing what she was going to say. Her mom opened the door with a smile that faded when she saw Lynn's serious expression and my presence, immediately knowing something was wrong. Lynn sat her mother down in the living room and explained everything from the diagnosis phone call on her wedding morning to the treatment she'd been receiving to the clinical trial she was starting. Her mom's face went through shock, devastation, and then anger as she realized Lynn had kept this secret for weeks. She stood up and started pacing, asking why Lynn didn't tell her immediately, how she could go through this alone, why she felt like she had to destroy her wedding instead of just being honest. Lynn tried to explain her panic and her misguided attempt to protect Oliver, but her mom wasn't ready to hear explanations yet. Then her mom just broke down crying and pulled Lynn into a tight hug, holding her daughter and sobbing into her shoulder. I sat quietly in the corner armchair, feeling like an intruder in this raw family moment, but Lynn had asked me to be there, so I stayed. Her mom finally pulled back and looked at me, asking if I'd been helping take care of Lynn, and I nodded, saying that Oliver and I were both supporting her through treatment. She thanked me with tears still streaming down her face, and I felt the weight of Lynn's trust in bringing me into this conversation with her mother. The trial schedule created a new problem when Oliver looked at the treatment calendar and realized it overlapped with a critical period at his job. He was working on a major project with tight deadlines, and his boss had already warned him that the next month would require extra hours and full presence. Oliver was torn between his career responsibilities and wanting to be there for Lynn, texting me late one night that the guilt was eating him alive. He'd already used personal days for Lynn's earlier appointments and couldn't afford to jeopardize his job, but how could he prioritize work when Lynn was starting a potentially life-saving treatment? I didn't know what to tell him because both things felt equally important and impossible to balance. Lynn made the decision for him by telling him firmly that she needed him to keep his job and his stability, that he couldn't put his whole life on hold for her. She said she had me and her mom to help with transportation during the intensive phase, and Oliver could visit on weekends and be there for the monitoring appointments that fell outside work hours. Oliver argued that he should be there for the first treatment at least, but Lynn stood her ground, saying that his financial security mattered too, and she wasn't going to let him sacrifice his career. The conversation happened over text in our group chat, and I could feel Oliver's frustration and guilt through the screen, but Lynn was right that we needed to think practically about sustainability. This was going to be months of treatment, and we all needed to maintain our lives and incomes to actually be helpful long-term. 2 days later, Oliver texted, asking if I wanted to grab coffee before Lynn's next appointment, and I agreed, even though my stomach twisted with nerves about facing him one-on-one. We met at a place halfway between our apartments, sitting across from each other in a booth by the window, while rain streaked down the glass outside. Oliver stirred his coffee for a long time, before looking up and admitting he'd been acting like we were in some kind of contest for who could help Lynn more. I nodded and said I'd been doing the same thing, using caregiving tasks as a way to prove something instead of just being useful. He told me that stepping back from daily care didn't mean he loved her less. It meant he was trying to keep his job and his sanity, so he could actually be there for the long haul. I admitted I'd been avoiding my own feelings by staying busy with Lynn's needs, letting myself believe that if I was helpful enough, it might change how she saw me. Oliver leaned back and said we'd both been kind of idiots about this, competing when we should have been working together. I agreed, and we sat there in silence for a minute, before he suggested we try actually communicating, instead of just texting logistics in the group chat. We talked through a basic plan where he'd handle certain appointments, and I'd cover others, where we'd check in with each other about how Lynn was doing instead of assuming, where we'd both back off when she asked for space. Something shifted between us during that conversation. Not friendship exactly, but something like respect, an acknowledgement that we both cared about the same person, and that didn't have to make us enemies. My therapy session with Isabel the following week dug into what a healthy caregiver-friend role actually looked like, versus what I'd been doing. She asked me to describe what I was getting out of helping Lynn, and I stumbled through an answer about wanting to be there for her and feeling useful. Isabel waited, and then asked what I was really hoping would happen if I did everything right. I sat with that question for a while before admitting, I guess I was hoping Lynn would see how much I cared and maybe feel differently about me. Isabel pointed out that was me trying to be her romantic partner through the back door, using caregiving as a way to stay in the relationship I wanted instead of accepting the one we actually had. She helped me work through what genuine friendship without expectations would look like, finding satisfaction in being helpful because it was the right thing to do, not because it might earn me something. We talked about my pattern of putting Lynn on a pedestal since high school, defining my worth through whether she chose me, avoiding other relationships because I was waiting for her. Isabel said untangling years of wishful thinking was hard work, but I was starting to do it, starting to see a version of myself that existed independently of unrequited love. I left that session feeling raw, but also a little lighter, like maybe I could actually be the friend Lynn needed instead of the guy who kept hoping for more. Before starting the clinical trial, Lynn decided she wanted to cut her hair short rather than waiting for chemo to take it. She texted both Oliver and me asking if we'd come with her to the salon, saying she wanted people there who cared about her when she did this. We met at a place near her apartment on a Saturday morning, and Lynn was already in the chair when we arrived, talking to the stylist about how short to go. The stylist was kind and experienced, explaining she did this for cancer patients regularly, and Lynn could go as short as she wanted. Lynn chose a pixie cut, something she'd never had the courage to try before, and we sat on either side of her chair while the stylist worked. Oliver held her left hand, and I held her right, and we took turns squeezing when big chunks of her long brown hair fell to the floor. Lynn watched in the mirror with tears streaming down her face, but she didn't look away, didn't ask the stylist to stop. When it was finished, she looked completely different, her face more visible, her features sharper, and she touched the short hair carefully like she was meeting a stranger. She told her reflection she was taking control back from cancer's timeline, choosing when and how things changed with her body instead of letting the disease decide everything. Oliver said she looked beautiful, and I agreed, and for once it didn't feel competitive, just two people telling her the truth. That evening, Lynn sat on her couch with her laptop and drafted a social media post, reading it out loud to herself and changing words until it felt right. She thanked people for their support and asked for continued privacy as she started a new treatment, mentioning the clinical trial without giving too many details. She included a photo of her new short hair with a small smile, taking control of her own story instead of letting rumors and speculation fill the silence. Oliver and I both saw it when she posted and immediately texted our support in the group chat. The response came fast and overwhelmingly positive, friends and acquaintances commenting with encouragement and heart emojis. Several cancer survivors reached out privately to Lynn, sharing their own experiences and offering advice about managing side effects. One woman sent a long message about the same trial Lynn was entering, what to expect, what helped her get through the rough days. Lynn read these messages with tears in her eyes, telling us she hadn't expected this kind of community, hadn't realized how many people understood what she was facing. The post helped her feel less alone and also put boundaries around what information she was willing to share, letting her control the narrative instead of being talked about. 2 weeks later, Lynn moved temporarily to a small furnished apartment near the research hospital for the intensive phase of the trial. Oliver and I helped her pack and drive her stuff over, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator. The apartment was basic but clean, 1 bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a view of the parking lot. Lynn set up a group text with Oliver, me, and her mom for regular updates, establishing clear communication so everyone felt connected even with the physical distance. She promised to text at least once a day with how she was feeling and what was happening with treatment, and we all agreed not to bombard her with constant check-ins. I told her I'd visit on weekends when I could, bringing books and snacks and just keeping her company through the boring parts of treatment. Oliver said he'd come when work allowed and send care packages during the week with things she needed. Her mom planned to visit every other week, giving Lynn space but staying involved. The structure helped everyone feel less anxious about the distance, knowing there was a plan for staying connected and sharing information. My weekend visits fell into a comfortable routine over the next month. I'd drive up Saturday morning with a bag of books, magazines, and whatever snacks Lynn was craving that week, and we'd spend the day watching bad reality TV shows and reading in companionable silence. We didn't try to force deep conversations or process everything that was happening, just existed together in the small apartment while she rested between treatments. Lynn said these normal moments helped her feel like a person instead of just a patient, gave her brain a break from thinking about cancer and side effects and scan results. I'd usually stay over on her couch and drive back Sunday evening, and the low-stakes nature of these visits felt more sustainable than the intensity of those first few weeks after the wedding. Oliver sent care packages during the week with practical items like ginger tea for nausea, soft blankets, puzzle books, and funny cards that made her laugh. He'd include little notes about random things happening at work or something stupid his neighbor did, giving her windows into normal life outside the hospital bubble. Oliver and I started texting more frequently beyond just the group chat, coordinating Lynn's needs and sharing updates about how she seemed to be doing. The conversations gradually shifted from pure logistics to more personal stuff, tentative but honest. He admitted one night that he'd been jealous of my history with Lynn, all those years of friendship and shared memories he wasn't part of. I texted back that I'd been jealous of what he had with her, the romantic relationship and future plans I never got. Being honest about the jealousy somehow made it lose its power, like acknowledging it out loud meant we didn't have to keep performing around it. We started relating to each other as real people instead of rivals, discovering we actually had some things in common beyond Lynn. He recommended a podcast I ended up liking. I sent him a funny meme about his favorite sports team, small interactions that built something like friendship between us. It felt strange, but also good, this shift from competition to cooperation, and I think we both realized we were going to be in each other's lives for a while, so we might as well make it work. At the end of Lynn's first trial cycle, we all met at the research hospital for her follow-up appointment with Dr. Sloan. Lynn was nervous, picking at her nails in the waiting room, while Oliver and I tried to distract her with conversation. Dr. Sloan came out and brought us all back to her office, spreading scan images across her desk and pointing to specific areas. She explained the results were mixed, Some tumor markers had decreased while others stayed stable, but overall there was measurable improvement in Lynn's symptoms and blood work. It wasn't a miracle cure, doctor. Sloan was careful to emphasize that, but it was genuine progress that meant the brutal treatment was actually working. Lynn started crying with relief, covering her face with her hands while her shoulders shook. Oliver moved his chair closer and put his arm around her, and I sat there feeling my own eyes get wet, watching her process this small victory. Dr. Sloan smiled and said this was exactly the kind of response they hoped to see after the first cycle, and they'd continue monitoring closely as treatment progressed. We left the hospital in a strange mood, not quite celebrating but not devastated either, learning to appreciate small wins without expecting perfection or guaranteed outcomes. The financial picture started looking better as different pieces came together. The charity travel grant Jasmine connected Lynn with covered most of her gas and parking costs for hospital trips. The vendor deposits Jasmine had recovered gave Lynn a cushion in her savings account instead of drowning in wedding debt. Lynn had been careful with her budget, cutting unnecessary expenses and accepting help when offered. Oliver quietly paid for some of her medications and co-pays without making a big deal about it, just handling it and moving on. Lynn accepted the help with more grace than before, learning that letting people support her wasn't the same as being a burden. She wasn't wealthy by any means, but she wasn't panicking about money on top of everything else, which removed one major source of anxiety. The relief of not having to choose between treatment and rent made everything else feel slightly more manageable, gave her mental space to focus on getting better instead of constantly calculating costs. I went to my boss and formally requested to make my flexible work arrangement permanent, taking a small pay cut, but gaining better work-life balance. He listened to my explanation about needing to support Lynn through her treatment and said my reliability and communication through this difficult time had actually impressed him. He approved the schedule adjustment and said he respected me for being honest about my priorities instead of trying to hide what was going on. The stability of knowing I had this arrangement locked in felt good, removed the uncertainty about whether I could keep helping Lynn without jeopardizing my job. I realized I was building a life that actually worked for me, instead of just revolving around Lynn's needs or my feelings about her. The therapy with Isabel was helping me see that having my own stable foundation made me a better friend, that taking care of myself wasn't selfish, but necessary. I left that meeting with my boss feeling like maybe I was finally growing up, learning to balance caring about someone with maintaining my own life and boundaries. 3 weeks later, Oliver texted asking if we wanted to go back to the pier. Lynn said yes immediately, which surprised me since that place held so many bad memories. But when we pulled into the parking lot on a cool October evening, Lynn climbed out wearing a beanie over her short hair and moved carefully, but with purpose. We walked onto the pier together, the three of us side by side this time instead of the chaos of that first visit. The funnel cake stand was still there, and Oliver ordered without asking what we wanted, remembering our usual toppings from years of friendship. We ate slowly, watching the sun drop toward the horizon and painting everything orange and pink. Lynn laughed at something Oliver said about his coworker, and the sound felt normal, not forced or fragile. I caught Oliver's eye over Lynn's head, and something passed between us, an understanding that we'd survived something terrible together. We'd gone from that awful moment on the Ferris wheel to this quiet evening, and the distance between those 2 points felt massive. The pier was just a pier now, not a crime scene or a battlefield, just a place where 3 people could eat fried dough and watch the sunset. Walking back toward the parking lot, Lynn stopped to look at the Ferris wheel, and neither Oliver nor I tried to rush her. She stood there for a minute, then turned and kept walking, and we followed. I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet acceptance that had been building for weeks. I loved Lynn, probably always would, but I didn't need her to love me back the same way anymore. She was my oldest friend, and I wanted her to live and be happy, and that was enough. The desperate wanting that had defined so much of my life had shifted into something calmer, something I could actually live with. Oliver caught my eye again and gave me a genuine smile, not the polite kind, but the real thing. We'd built something like trust between us through all the hospital visits and care coordination and late-night texts about medication schedules. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was solid. That evening, the 3 of us sat on Lynn's couch and set up a weekly video call schedule. Oliver pulled out his calendar app, and we blocked out Thursday evenings for check-ins about Lynn's appointments, medication refills, transportation needs, and how everyone was actually doing. Lynn insisted we include our own needs too, not just hers, making sure Oliver talked about his work stress, and I mentioned my therapy sessions. The system wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable, with clear roles and honest communication, replacing the chaos of those first terrible weeks. Lynn still had months of treatment ahead, but she wasn't facing it alone. We were learning to show up for each other in ways that actually helped, instead of just performing care to feel better about ourselves. So yeah, that's the whole story. Life doesn't always give us Hollywood endings, but sometimes we get something better. Real people choosing to stay and figure it out together. If you appreciated this one, go ahead and hit that like button. You all mean the world to me, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care of each other out there.